Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Forum. I'm Carl Villacova from Monmouth University's Urban Coast Institute and a member of the Marco Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal team. Before we get started this morning, just a few items on the tech side to run through. Today's webinar will be hosted by GoToWebinar. Attendees are in listen-only mode by default. Please type all questions, comments, and messages in the questions/chat box. We encourage you to add questions at any time during the presentation for any of the speakers. The organizers may also share info with attendees in the questions chat box. For example, if a report is referenced and we want to share a link to that or something along those lines. A link to today's webinar will be active all day, so the same link that you're using here will be good to get you back into the other sessions that come up after this. And we will be recording this webinar, and a copy of this will be posted on midatlanticocean.org within a couple of days after the session. To register for additional days, please log on at midatlanticocean.org. Thank you very much, and now I'll turn it over to Daryl.
Good morning. Thank you, Carl, and good morning to everyone. I'm Daryl Francois. I work in the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Office of Renewable Energy Programs. I'm part of the management team that's responsible for managing the regulatory framework that governs the development of renewable energy projects on the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf. I'm pleased to moderate this session today, and I'll give a brief overview, and then we'll get started with our presenters. Our session objectives will feature panelists who will share lessons learned from an agency and stakeholder perspective about information needed to inform decision-making regarding the development of offshore wind renewable energy projects. The panelists will discuss the implications of these lessons for future development, including best practices for data and information sharing, and how early and ongoing coordination between states, federal agencies, tribes, and the fisheries management councils can play a role. Next slide. During the first part of the session this morning, we'll hear from Mary Boatman, who is a scientist with our Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and will discuss efforts to observe environmental effects from offshore wind facility installation in real time. Then George Detweiler with the U.S. Coast Guard will talk about the marine transportation system and the information needs that it's to assist in its development and management. Then Nick Napoli with Marco and the Northeast Regional Ocean Council and working with the data portals will cover early sharing of information and data. Next slide. The second part of our session this morning, we'll hear from Brian Zelinki with NOAA, and he'll discuss the oceanographic observing system's purpose and potential to mitigate wind turbine interference with those systems. Then Lindy Heiss-Dutton with the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance will talk about fisheries resource research and monitoring. And finally, Captain Stuart Griffin with the Mariners Advisory Committee for the Bay and River Delaware will share his perspective from someone active in the maritime industry. After each panel finishes their presentations, we'll have a panel discussion and take questions from the audience. So please think of questions or comments and type them into the chat area, type them into the chat boxes Carl talked about earlier. But before we hear from our first presenters, next slide, I want to start with some highlights about offshore wind energy in the United States over the past decade and a half. Many of you are familiar with the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which amended the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to regulate offshore renewable energy resources. Those provisions in the EPACT 05 also required coordination with affected state, local, and tribal governments and relevant federal agencies. And in addition, established an OCS digital mapping initiative that we know as the Marine Cadastre at BOEM and at NOAA, but that is directly feeds into the data portals that we use on a regular basis. Our renewable energy regulations were finalized in 2009, and that led to a series of lease sales for offshore wind energy development on the northeast and mid-Atlantic, along the northeast and mid-Atlantic coast. But also ocean planning was a key component of our efforts and a key component of our intergovernmental coordination, collaboration, and stakeholder engagement. At the same time as those renewable energy regulations were being implemented, the regional ocean partnerships were actively working, MARCO and NROC, to incorporate that key component of intergovernmental coordination and stakeholder engagement. Standing here today or viewing us today on screen, there are currently 17 wind energy leases on the Atlantic OCS from Massachusetts down to offshore North Carolina. And currently, BOEM is reviewing 16 proposed projects. So the information we are discussing today will be looking back at those lessons learned since 2009 up to 2021, and how can we implement those lessons learned moving forward to see the review and of projects proposed and implementation of building wind energy facilities offshore moving forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, Dr. Mary Boatman, and I will give her the floor. Thank you for being here.
Well, good morning, everybody. As Daryl introduced, I'm Mary Boatman. I'm with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and I coordinate our science activities along the Atlantic in support of the Office of Renewable Energy Programs. As a little bit of background, I just want to say that BOEM has an environmental studies program that's mandated by Congress to collect information about the natural and human environment and to assess the activities that BOEM permits. One of these studies that we have funded through the Environmental Studies Program is the Real-Time Opportunity for Development Environmental Observations, or RODEO. I know it's a bit of a mouthful. And this study started in 2015 to be out in the field and look at the first energy development projects. And as you know, the first one was Block Island Wind Farm off of Rhode Island. Next slide. Now, the purpose of the RODEO project or program was to collect real-time measurements during the construction and operation of activities from the first facilities to allow for more accurate assessments of the actual environmental effects and inform development of appropriate mitigation measures. Now, this also included testing different types of equipment, as well as the potential to test monitoring and to see the viability of different types of monitoring. Most importantly, it was not meant to duplicate anything that was required of industry, and it wasn't meant to interfere with anything that was required of industry. So it was allow us to understand that science, address science questions beyond just what was expected from industry. Next slide. So within the program, we looked at various topic areas that include air quality, sound, seafloor, visual impacts, testing of, as I said, of monitoring equipment, and evaluation of mitigation equipment. Next slide. And for this, we hired a team. HDR was our prime contractor. And as you can see, it included the University of Rhode Island and Woods Hole, the University Prospect, Marine Acoustics, a private company, as well as Subacoustic and Fugro, who had European members. So we've also brought over the European experience as a part of the project. Next slide. Now at Block Island, we focused on recording the activities. So we wanted to understand exactly what occurred and how long those activities occurred. We monitored sound both airborne and underwater. We looked at seafloor disturbance and recovery. We had 3 years of benthic monitoring. We tested a scour monitoring device. And then we also looked at the cable laying. And I'm going to share some of what we did in more detail. Next slide. And as you can see here, this is during the installation. We're out taking pictures, photo documenting it. They're putting in the foundation, putting in the pins that were used to attach or hold the foundation to the seafloor. And you can see they use pile driving to get those pins in. I want to point out, for example, people think of pile driving as occurring over several days. The actual pile driving event takes about 30 minutes. So it's important when you're trying to model and understand these sounds. Next slide. Of course, we're out measuring. People always have questions about what's the sound from these turbines in the air. Is it going to be disturbing them? We've measured sound right next to the wind turbine, as well as at Southeast Lighthouse, which is 3 miles, Point Judith, which is 17 miles, and Newport, which is about 25 miles. Remember, most of the future projects will be at least 10 to 12 miles, if not more, from the coast. And we wanted to verify this. People were concerned about it. We measured it. It's very hard to measure because obviously there's a lot of sound, like at the beach. There's the wind, there's rustling leaves, there's waves. So understanding the sound in perspective from the wind turbines in respect to everything else. Next slide. And most importantly, probably the most impactful aspect is pile driving and the sound produced during pile driving. And we were out measuring from various distances, testing out different types of equipment. Different equipment can measure different aspects of sound. We were also out doing something called particle motion, which is really the sound pressure. So if you think about, you go to a concert and you sit next to next to the speaker, you can feel the sound. You don't just hear it, but you can actually feel it. So sound pressure is very important as well. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we did some benthic monitoring. We've done 3 years. This is collecting seafloor samples around 3 of the turbines, as well as at reference sites. And then we also did video transects to look at what was growing there. Next slide. And as you can see, putting a structure into the marine environment, it creates essentially an artificial reef, or has an artificial reef effect. And in this case for Block Island, they were quickly encrusted with blue mussels, as well as other marine organisms. These mussels die. They also put out organic matter onto the seafloor, and it attracts other life, including things like black sea bass. And when these foundations have now become popular places for recreational fishing. Next slide. We also looked at the disturbance of the seafloor. Obviously, they're using jack-up barges. They do other things like installing the cable. We wanted to understand how quickly the seafloor can recover. And as you can see, if you go from left to right, it's the 5 different turbines in the columns, and then 5 different sampling events. The top one was before the tower and nacelles were installed. The second one was right after, and you can see the indentations from the jack-up barge. And as you go through time successively over the next 1.5 to 2 years, you see most of these marks being erased or removed simply because of natural processes from redistribution of sediments and the currents. However, as you can also see, it's different in different locations, and it very much depends on the current regime locally. I mean, these turbines are only about 2 miles apart from end to end, as well as the sediment type that they're installed in. Next slide. And then, as I mentioned, we use the scour monitor testing, and they attach these 2 devices onto one of the turbines foundations. It uses lasers to look at the seafloor, and we were able to monitor changes in the seafloor 24 hours, 7 days a week for over a year, and able to watch the natural fluctuation as well as to look any kind of scour or winnowing around the base of the structure as a result of the currents. And what I found most interesting was that the seafloor is not static. It moves up and down of its own, and I hadn't really thought of that before this study. Next slide. We also went out during this cable installation. One of the concerns with that, of course, is sediment plumes. And we were measuring the sediment plumes during the installation. Next slide. And we use various optical techniques as well as water sampling. One of the issues is with modeling the plume, the level and distance of the plume and the amount of the plume through modeling was about 100 times greater than the actual measured. So this is the case where usually in the measurements, you can go back, recalibrate your models, and then make better predictions for the future. Next slide. Now, we also went out this past summer when the 2 turbines were installed off of Virginia. This is the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project. And again, we measured the underwater acoustic sounds. In this case, they were installing monopiles rather than that jacket structure. And we also are able to test the viability of something called a double bubble curtain. And essentially, they encapsulate the area where the turbine is being installed with a big garden hose that's got little holes in it, and then they pump air through it. Now they have 2 of them in a ring because more bubbles, it's more efficient at reducing the sound. And we were out there measuring the sound fairly close to the activity and very far away. And we were also fortunate because it was 2 turbines and it was a research location that we used the bubble curtain for the installation of one and no bubble curtain for the second one, so we could do a comparison and really understand better how the sound was being attenuated. And overall, the sound was reduced by about 10 decibels. However, the best sound reduction occurred for higher frequencies, whereas the lower frequencies were not as attenuated as much. And we have that report. We're still examining the data. Next slide. And finally, we are out there right now monitoring CVOW to actually address some engineering questions, things about corrosion, biofouling, and then turbidity around the turbines. We have moorings that have fouling plates. We have moorings that have planches that are being corroded. They go out every 3 months, switch these out and measure the amount of corrosion. We're also looking at the turbine and watching the growth as we saw at Block Island, only this time for CVOW, it seems to be more barnacles rather than mussels because it is a different part of the marine environment. And then we're also looking at turbidity, monitoring the oceanographic conditions, as well as using optical methods to look at the amount of the sediment in the water column. And then finally, in closing, last slide. Sorry, I just got my coffee delivery. You can find out more about this study and all of our studies. We've funded and have published about 80 studies. We have final reports. We have another 20 or so ongoing for the Atlantic, as well as we have studies on the Pacific because there's activities there. And you can go to the BOEM website. Just go to the home page, hover over renewable energy. There'll be a drop-down box and you'll see the word studies. Click on studies. It'll take you to the page. We have a whole page of just about RODEO with all the reports that are now available. And also you can look at all of our other studies in the different areas that we're learning about. And with that, I'll turn it back to Daryl.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate that very much. And I can attest to the thoroughness of the webpage. The information we have on the webpage is very extensive, and I encourage anyone who is interested in those study results to take a look there. Now, I'll turn it over to our next presenter, Mr. George Detweiler. Mr. Detweiler retired from the U.S. Coast Guard with over 20 years of service. His military career included 2 tours afloat and a tour as a commanding officer of a Lorraine station in Italy. He returned to the Coast Guard as a civilian marine transportation specialist in the Marine Transportation Systems Directorate at U.S. Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I've known George for about 10 years now, and we've worked closely as he has gone through and worked on several initiatives on the East Coast, the Atlantic Coast Port Access Route Study, and the Right Whale route studies, creating ships routing measures and proposals around those studies. Mr. Detweiler works closely with the Coast Guard's National Navigation Safety Advisory Council on safety and navigation issues. He is a member of the U.S. delegation to the International Maritime Organization's Subcommittee on Navigation, Communication, and Search and Rescue. Very knowledgeable person and a great colleague to work with. George, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Daryl, for those kind words. I think it's longer than 10 years, but I'll take it because anything longer than that makes me seem older. But you described, who I am and what I do, and I appreciate that very much. Next slide, please. In developing this presentation, I was trying to think of, what kind of fits for all, and that's why I started it out as the Marine Transportation System, or MTS, for all users. You can translate that to the use of all of the United States waterways, oceans, rivers, etc., and so forth, but predominantly the oceans. Our major goal is obviously to make sure that the waterways are safe, especially and secure for all mariners. To the extent it's practicable, we need to reconcile the need for safe access routes with all the other needs of uses in the area. We need to make sure that our national defense vessels can move safely, as well as commercial traffic. And we definitely need commercial traffic to get to and from our ports safely, because that's how we do an awful lot of our trade, and how we get things as simple as that toaster that you get from Walmart, or fuel or whatever. So we need to make sure that the vessels can definitely transit U.S. waters. In a nutshell, we want to protect all mariners. It doesn't matter who they are or what type they are. In addition, we want to protect property. And in this case, since we're discussing wind farms, that would be the property we want to protect as well. And of course, we have an obligation, just like most other government agencies do, is to protect the environment. We have to make sure that endangered species aren't harmed, oil spills don't happen, and those type of things. Another facet for the MTS is we want to make sure it's efficient and economical to the best of our ability. This equates to distance and time. If wind farm development were to force mariners to go longer paths or longer transit times, that's a cost. It would be a cost that would pass to both the mariners and to their customers. And it could even impact ports, in the fact that shipping lines may decide to not visit a particular port because it's too difficult to get in and out, and they'd rather go somewhere else. We also think this system needs to be resilient. What that means to us is whatever we design, whatever we come up with, there must be minimal changes, and especially over time. We can't create something and then 2 or 3 or 4 years later, we need to change it. We need to make it last as long as we can before we absolutely, due to changing data and changing information, that we have to make adjustments. Next slide, please. All of what I described falls under what we call marine planning efforts being done by the Coast Guard. And how we do that, we create policies. They fall under things like our Commandant instructions and manuals. I would say that they would be our internal. Then we can create certain regulations, such as for fairways or anchorages or regulated navigation areas or traffic separation schemes. And I'd call them external. In other words, there's regulations that are published, and mariners have to follow them or use them. Some of our standards you may be familiar with fall under our NAVIC 019. This document is used by both the Coast Guard, BOEM, some other agencies, and primarily the developers. And within that document, we also outline our marine planning guidelines. Mitigations are things that we need to develop as well, and they can vary from everything from possibly suggesting to BOEM or recommending to BOEM spacing and orientation of farms, marking and lighting of those particular farms, and all in all, they help us develop solutions in the end to, again, support navigation safety, back to our mantra. Next, please. Some of the tools we use. We use navigation safety risk assessments, and we have a particular tool to evaluate those that are done by the developers. They do the initial one, and we look at it and review it and assess it. We also have established a peer review panel of mostly senior people at Coast Guard headquarters that will look at that and look at our proposed answer back to BOEM. So it helps us ground truth a lot of what we're trying to do. We do things like port access route studies. Right at the moment, we have, I believe, 4, if I'm counting correctly, going on. 3 in what we call our 5th Coast Guard district, off of North Carolina, off of Virginia, off of Delaware, New Jersey. There's another one up in the New York Bight area. And this is, again, to look at data and traffic and decide what kind of measures may need to be done to, again, ensure that that the traffic can do what it needs to do, as well as other users will have space available for them to be able to do what they would need to do. And in this case, again, BOEM and the creation of wind farms. We use another tool called a PAWSA, Ports and Waterway Safety Assessment. They're predominantly more what I refer to as inside or closer to the ports, but their principles can be used outside as well. We definitely use data portals in two directions. One is we provide data to the data portals, especially AIS data. But then we look at that same data and the way it's presented and the different layers and help us to do our job. And so the data portals are very important to us. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we do data analysis. We look at AIS. We will look at that VMS data that is available. And a lot of that is done, a lot of that analysis is done at our navigation center, which is in Alexandria, who actually works for my directorate. So they're very well schooled. They've stood up a division to be able to do a lot of that. And we're really appreciative of the work they're doing. And of course, we can't forget as a planning tool, stakeholder outreach. We have to talk to stakeholders. We can't do this all in a vacuum. We have to know what they're thinking. Some of the organizations we deal with could be American Waterways Operators, World Shipping Council, pilots, various fishing groups, various maritime organizations, harbor safety committees, and I can make the list go on and on and on. So, but again, stakeholder outreach is another, we call it a tool to help us out, and we definitely value it, and we search it out very actively. Next, please. This is just an example of something that our NavCen has done for us. Basically, by vessel types, they would break down the AIS data by vessel types, give us the particular numbers, and you notice on this slide, it's not only the number of unique vessels, but it's also the number of transits by those particular vessels. So for example, pleasure craft, we estimate about 3,000 vessels in that particular year of study, but they made about 20,000 transits through the waterways. So this is one area of data analysis that we look at to help support wherever we're going to go in creating routing measures or other facets that we need to do to, again, protect the MTS. Next, please. This is just a different way of looking at it. This is a heat map that NavCen did for us in support of our New Jersey Port Access Route Study. And it shows fishing vessels from the year 2019. Obviously, the red is a higher concentration, but it gives us an idea of how these vessels transit. Believe me, we're not really concerned about where they fish necessarily. That's theirs to know, and I know fishermen like to kind of keep their spot secret, but again, we need to know where they're going so we can protect them. It's very, very important. Next, please. Changes and lessons learned. I've been involved in wind farms in my office since the original Cape Wind, and obviously we've learned an awful lot. One of the things we've known over the last 10, 15, 20 years is that ocean uses are increasing and they're competing. Again, the ocean uses of shipping, offshore renewable energy installations, agriculture, fishing, both commercial and recreation, space ops, they all want to use the ocean. And at times the Coast Guard feels we're playing referee and trying to make sure that, yes, we can all use it. Since the beginning too, we've noticed that many, many more government entities have been involved. Before it just seemed to be maybe a county, maybe a portion of a state. Now it's definitely virtually every federal agency is involved at some point or another. State agencies, not just the state, but state agencies, local agencies, tribal, they're all involved. They all want to be part of the development of this and make sure, again, their entities are taken care of as well. Some of the lessons learned, wind farms do create environmental impact, as Dr. Boatman talked about, and we try to understand that. We also have to understand that if we're going to create certain measures that we don't impact things like endangered species, right whales, sturgeon, other type of animals. Again, lessons learned. Data and studies are very, very important. While they're time consuming, they can answer an awful lot of questions. They can also document and put down baselines that allow us to move forward with hopefully the right decisions. Early engagement. We have to engage with others, and we have to be able to engage ourselves early on in the process. The earlier, the better. So that if there are any conflicts, or at least perceived conflicts, they can be discussed, analyzed, and then maybe adjusted for. Another way of saying that as well is compromise. Not everybody that uses the waterway are going to be able to get all that they want. It's just impossible. But I think if we, keep compromise in the back of our heads and be able to talk with the various groups and discuss options and show if we do one thing, this is the result, those type of things, compromise can really work. What I call speed of advance. This industry is taking off. There's no doubt about it. And we understand that the administration obviously gave it even a bigger jump start or a kick in the seat of the pants, however you want to term it. We just need to make sure and be wary of that the speed of advance isn't so fast that we miss things. We can't afford to miss things. We can't afford to do this wrong. If we do it wrong, the environment's going to really, really suffer. Industries may really, really suffer. People may suffer. Another lesson learned is standard requirements. While we don't have a set standard spacing, we have gone from really very minimal guidance to things like orientation and grid patterns. We're in constant discussion about standard requirements, but at the moment right now, we still believe the best course of action is for us to judge each wind farm on its own merits and its own proposal, and then we work from there. Again, I talked about spacing. Other mitigations need to be identified as well. Reporting procedures, 24-hour watch stations, possible use of cameras, marking and lighting, and painting. All these things come into play, again, as mitigations and to help protect the system and the mariners and all the user groups. In a nutshell, we're still learning. Again, this industry is changing faster and faster. Turbines are getting larger and larger. Farms are larger and larger. More locations are coming. We know there's talk about further south, off of South Carolina, possibly Georgia. We know the Gulf is looking very intensely at possible wind development. We also know the Pacific Coast and Hawaii have potential areas identified. And so, again, the process is moving, and it's moving very, very quickly, and we have to be very careful about it. And that ends my presentation. Thank you for allowing me to do it.
Thanks, George. I really appreciate that, and I think that you make some critical points about the speed of advance and standard requirements, and looking at, although you can look at standard requirements, looking at each wind farm in its own as an individual, but just keeping in mind that there are several out there that we have to look also how they integrate with each other too. So that's very, very good. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Our next presenter, Nick Napoli, is a senior advisor for Marco and Ocean Planning Director for the Northeast Regional Ocean Council. And in these capacities, Nick manages a range of ocean planning projects, including the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast ocean data portals. And I'm always impressed with his breadth of knowledge on offshore data. And I'm happy to have him here. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Nick, to give our last presentation for this session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daryl. And thank you, Daryl and Leanne and to Marco for inviting me to present on early sharing of information and data. And as Daryl mentioned, I have a number of responsibilities for Marco and NROC. Next slide, please. But one of those responsibilities for both of them is managing the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast Ocean data portals with some very good folks. And some of you probably know that Carl Villacoba is also a point of contact for the Mid-Atlantic Ocean data portal. And Emily Shimshinia is a point of contact for the Northeast Ocean data portal. And it's increasingly difficult for me to talk about these things as separate. There's certainly different sites, and the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast have different issues, but when we're talking about offshore wind and in particular, there's really a lot of similarities. And so I often say to folks, especially when we're talking about activities offshore, that if you're comfortable working with one, you're likely to get a lot of the same information in the other. So whichever one you're comfortable working with, please do that. We coordinate across very well, and a lot of the data, especially offshore, are similar. So for those of you who do not know, the portals, they contain, they're online tools that contain geospatial products or maps and we really focus on the footprint and changes over time for economic activities and ecological resources. And these have been on the internet now for over a decade, and many of our data sets have gone through many revisions, and we've learned a lot, and I think that's why Daryl and Leanne have asked me to talk about the early sharing of information and data and some of the lessons learned. All these products that we develop are derived from a range of sources. They're federal, they're state, they're tribal. We work a lot with the research and academic community to take some of their research and develop products from them. And of course, there are a lot of products that are really derived from our interactions with the different interest groups. And importantly, I think that one of the things that we do probably as much or more than anyone else is really make sure that we're convening the experts in any one topic to help us understand what data are out there, what products are needed, how they're being used, and even to vet our products before we post them. Next slide, please. These are generally the themes. We often talk about there are thousands of map products in our portals, and we try our best to sort of make them easily accessible and a logical workflow. And we do try and organize them under the same themes. You'll find roughly the same themes across the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast Ocean data portals. This is how we manage our data. And broadly, there's the ocean activities and economic themes and the ocean resource and condition themes, and you see them here. And we typically have work groups working on any one of these, and sometimes specific data products within any one of these themes. Next slide, please. So who's using the portal? We've seen probably about 4 years ago a significant increase in the use of both portals, and honestly, I think the hits are about the same on each of them, and that they are consistently, we see more consistent use in the last 4 years from time to time. But we also do see some increases in use, and we do track the hits on our data layers and the pages so that we understand how things are being used. And I often talk about this, and you'll see this graph on the bottom left. We definitely see increased layer hits during public meetings and public events, especially related to offshore wind. And you can see the increases in use associated with some wind energy meetings in late 2018. On the bottom right, you also see a note there that 20 to 30% of the layer hits from third-party sites. What we're saying there is that about 20 to 30% of our hits are from third-party sites that are taking our data into them. So you could go to their site and find our data. And in some cases, they're not necessarily public sites. We have noticed that there are private tools that are being developed, we think, that are using our web services for their own purposes. There's also a number of uses. This session is certainly about offshore wind, but our uses go well beyond offshore wind, where the data are used by the councils and the states for ocean planning, and we see a lot of educational uses of our portals, and certainly a lot of it is offshore wind related. Next slide, please. So this is probably indicative of the use for offshore wind. The text might be a little bit small, but I'm showing on the left here 1 year's worth of layer hits in the top 25 layers that were hit on the Marco portal, and you'll see that many of those are related to offshore energy. And you'll see that many of them are also related to other kinds of things you might want to consider when you're thinking about offshore energy, like where fishing is occurring, where fisheries resources or marine mammal resources are located. On the right, I just took a look yesterday at what our top layers were for March 2021, and you'll see that on the Northeast site, and you'll see that some of the active and pending or projects in review are in the top 10. And if I drew the next maybe 10 or 20, you'll see that many of the same layers as in the Marco portal showed up even in the month of March, including hits on our vessel traffic data layers, our marine life data layers, and our commercial fishing data layers. Next slide, please. So with this increased and consistent use, and we know the portals are being used to inform offshore wind, we have some responsibilities, and we understand this over time about providing guidance on how to use the data. And we know that when we started 10 years ago, there were not as many mapping applications or data that were available online. In the last decade, there's been a significant increase in the number of tools, mapping applications that are out there. And so we're trying to provide guidance on how to use all of these different tools and data throughout the process. And you'll see that a very general approach here is just to let folks know that there's a process of digging down further into the data, and that does work with some of these tools. The National Geospatial Mapping Tools, Ocean Reports, or Marine Cadastre will give you that general national level, consistent across the country view. Once you dig into the Northeast and Marco data portals, you'll see that there are thousands of products that those national portals do not have, that were developed by folks in the region for issues in the region. And we also say, and we spend a lot more time on this with some of our data sets and some of our trainings, is to let folks know where to get more specific data. Our products are regional aggregations. Sometimes they can be used at a very site-specific level if they have a high enough resolution. Sometimes, and a lot of times, you're going to find a lot better data from the states, the individual agencies, and from those portals on specific issues. And what I mean by that is you'll need to dig into the raw data and develop your own products for your own questions. The regional portals will give you that regional perspective, but digging into the state and individual agency data sets and developing products that are specific to those questions, what would be the next step. And of course, some of the Nearacous and Maracous websites, they also provide context for why some of these activities and resources are where they are. Next slide, please. We've been doing this since the first day, as we've been trying to work with the experts to develop, validate, and communicate the use of the data in the maps, and we've increased our outreach, and we do this across themes, and we encourage others to go back to a lot of these same communities that we engage to develop the products, because once you get that regional understanding of what's going on, you're going to have just as many questions, and these are a lot of the groups you need to go back to in order to find additional information. Next slide, please. Something we've heard in the last several years is that we need to increase the information and maps that are available about pending regulatory actions. And so with regard to offshore wind, we're coordinating closely with BOEM to provide information on the status of each of these projects, and then be very clear about when a project footprint in a proposed array shows up as a map, as a proposed map on our site. And what we've decided with BOEM is that once a project has gotten to the stage of notice of intent for an EIS, that's when we're going to start putting the proposed footprint in an array up on the site. This note on the right talks about proposed expansion areas, reef expansion areas. I just put that up because we're doing this across topics. I know this session's about offshore wind, but we're working closely with the Coast Guard to have consistent information about the PARs and some of the stuff George just talked about. We're working with the Corps of Engineers to ensure we have information around their actions up on the portals. We're working with the states. We're trying to do this more and more across agency actions so that there's map information associated with that action up on the site, because we know folks are using the sites for public comment. Next slide, please. And thank you very much. As I said, Carl and Emily are as good or better resources for information about the portals as I am. I encourage you to reach out to us, follow us on Twitter. That's where we have the latest and greatest. When we release a data set, that's where people hear about it first. And thank you very much, Daryl, for having me.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate it. And I think I just wanted to sort of have the three presenters for this session on screen to respond to a couple of questions that I have, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. And I'd just like to remind the audience to share any ideas that they have in the webinar chat box so that we can capture for additional suggestions for consideration. I'd like to sort of pose to the three of you the same two questions, and I think we can sort of go with Mary, George, and Nick in responding in order. And I first ask, what information would you most like to see added to the data portals, and in what form? And I'll turn it over to you, Mary, and then we'll hear from our other two presenters.
Well, Daryl, thank you very much. And after listening to Nick, I'm going to not answer your question. I've been, as you well know, I've been involved somehow with these data portals since their inception and watched them grow and evolve. And I'm a huge supporter of the data portals. I'm a huge supporter of data sharing. I think it's so important for all of our discussions that we have a shared data that's out there and transparent. I think the data portals have done an excellent job of making that, integrating all the different data sets that are available, making it available. I think it's important to keep up, first and foremost, what's out there and keep that up to date and evolving as things change. As Nick said, things have changed. And the second thing is it helps us move our discussions away from whose data is best or what data is this or who's got that data. If we all share our data, then we can move on to say, well, what's the best uses of our oceans and how do we best do that, and use that data to inform that discussion. So I didn't exactly answer your question, but that's my answer.
I'll accept that one. And George, you're next up.
Excuse me. Thanks, Daryl. Thanks, Nick, for your presentation. To be honest, if I understand it correctly, we're providing information. We mean the Coast Guard to Nick as far as shipping data. The latest and greatest is always important. AIS, we know VMS, there's some rules that are a little bit difficult, but whatever can be included should be included. I do like the idea of, putting the possible lease areas and or the, starting with the wind energy area development and maybe moving to the lease areas to have it in that location as well can help us out, even though I know we have other sources that we can get that information as well. I don't know that there's much else I can add to that.
Okay, thanks, George. Nick, what are you hoping to? What do you think is missing, or do you think anything is missing?
Yeah, well, there's definitely some gaps. And honestly, I think this is also a question. This is something we ask everyone else, right? What data is missing on the portal? So this is something we go to others and ask a lot about, and we've certainly heard a lot from folks. And that's how, as in my last slide, the fact that we're adding now maps around agency actions was in direct response to people telling us they want that. But I'll say, and we have a project in the Northeast related to this, and we'll have more to talk about this across both regions, I think, shortly. But we know there's a lot of data collection going on out there by the agencies and developers, and that's increased in the last several years, and that's probably going to increase. And we have tons of high resolution information out there that we know would make our products better. And so we would like to do more work with the the developers, the states and federal agencies that are also funding research out there to ensure that we can bring those data sets into our products. And I'm not necessarily saying access to raw data. We just want to improve our products. And we know that those data sets that are the data that are being collected can improve them.
Thanks. George, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, actually, with Nick speaking, that raised something for me is, and I think it may be included. I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to plead ignorance, but any future rulemaking that we're looking at, proposals which have not necessarily anything to do with wind farms, but do have to do with the marine transportation system. Example is new and/or improved anchorages. Eventually, we go out with a rulemaking. So maybe the stage would be is to, as we published, let's say, a notice to proposal rulemaking, which is usually we define the things and hopefully by geographic positions and things like that, that again could translate into a layer or a map that Nick could put on their portals. Again, if mariners are going there for other reasons, they may say, "Oh, I didn't know the Coast Guard was contemplating an anchorage at this particular location. I transit there all the time." So that may help. So again, our rulemaking may not have anything to do with energy. It may just be a particular rulemaking for the mariner that we're looking to upgrade or change or even delete, for that matter. And it may prompt questions and comments from the public.
Thanks, George. And I think I'll I think straight into my second question a little bit there, and I'll ask Mary to respond formally. What other information other than graphical data layers do you think are important to stakeholders and decision makers?
Yeah, hi, Daryl. Yeah, I'll answer this a little more directly. As you know, the data portals were developed for spatial planning and looking at things in the terms of maps. And then there's the other aspect of it all, which is time. So, we've done a lot of work with putting tags on and seeing how things move around over time. Spatial is sort of a static in time, one point in time, and you're looking at it. So also, as you know, there's the ocean observing systems. They're also looking at everything through time. So there's adding in that other aspect of how things are changing and moving and year over year, day over day, and getting that time aspect as well as the space.
George, you kind of started off there, but is there anything you'd like to add in terms of, you talked about Coast Guard proposals, about different routing measures and initiatives. Is there other information you think, other than graphical data, that should be put on there that are important?
That's a little tough one for me. Not sure. Again, anything that's new or changed, and I know that's more general, but again, if we're looking at routing measures, even if it starts out with when we announce a port access route study, that we're doing a study in this particular area, and we do define that by geographic boundaries, what area we're actually studying. So again, that may prompt the user groups that are looking at the portals to go, "Oh, okay, again, Coast Guard is doing a port access route study." I mean, we do announce them in the Federal Register, but as we all know, there's not an awful lot of people that like to read the Federal Register having coffee and donuts in the morning, so for breakfast. So maybe in this way, there you go. Maybe in this way we can, again, alert the public. Just another source of information that, hey, we are looking at this, and the public can comment on this, and we may end up getting comments on a port access route study that we didn't even think of, or a user group that all of a sudden comes out of the woodwork that we had no idea they existed. So again, maybe that might just trigger. So, our study areas, our routing measures, rulemaking and descriptions, and how they're presented. Probably a lot of it would be, again, a data layer of some form, but even just a picture would help out.
Thanks. And Nick, it was interesting to see your slide on what people are looking for in terms of what they're coming to pick off. Do you get requests for other information up there than what you have now?
Yeah, we certainly we have actually. I'll I'll follow up to Mary and George too in answering this. We have heard a lot about providing information about changes over time. So we've been doing that a little bit more in the last couple of years, but that's really hard to visualize, and it's really hard to present to people. And we're working on that. We are doing that with fish species and marine mammals and even ship traffic over time. But as time goes on, that gets increasingly difficult to do. We have been providing and working to provide information, a map when something hits the Federal Register, as George was talking about, because even if you are interested in reading the Federal Register with your coffee in the morning, you will get a map of the area, but it'll be out of context, right? It won't be within the context of everything else that's going on in the region. The last thing we definitely hear a lot about is economic data. We have some economic data on the portals. That's a hard thing to present to folks, and it's even a hard thing to agree on. What's the appropriate economic study for a particular industry or use or activity that should belong in the portals?
Thanks, Nick. I'm not going to take advantage of that last comment and make any jokes about economists. So, but there is a question in the chat for you, Mary, specifically, and maybe I could enlarge that a little bit. Is that are you monitoring bird activity at CVOW? And I guess I would sort of enlarge that and say, does BOEM have any future plans for monitoring programs with other projects and ongoing with the existing ones?
Okay, two parts. So yes, at CVOW, they are monitoring for birds, and they're using some really interesting types of ways of monitoring. I was just looking at some data this past week where they're using like infrared and trying to see birds at night and such. I can't go into any more detail on that because I'm not the lead for that, but yes, we definitely are monitoring for birds and testing out different ways and technologies monitoring for the birds. And then, of course, as I said, the RODEO project started in 2015. We can only do 5-year contracts, a government thing. The contract has expired, but we're about to award a new contract for another 5 years to continue. And we have obviously Vineyard Wind, which may be built in the next couple of years, South Fork, and other projects that may come up within the next 5 years that we can go out and continue our studies.
Thank you. Nick, I see a question here asking about if Marco has any plans to include vetted ocean climate model outputs in the data portals. And I guess vetted is sort of a key word in that question. Any thoughts along those lines, or any suggestions along those lines?
I think I'd love to hear more of what's being suggested, but I would say generally yes. There's been definitely a lot of discussion recently about both how climate affects species distributions and could affect species distributions in the future, and I think those are things that Marco has looked at in the past and would like to do more of. And I would encourage whoever asked that question to come to the lunch session today for the data portal.
That's a good suggestion. Yes, that the lunch sessions we have today are open for some open discussion. So please feel free to attend those after these 2 panel sessions. I thank all 3 of you for very extensive presentations. Nick, those slides you showed about who is using what and where, I think were very illustrative. And Mary, the information about the different monitoring, I appreciate that. And George, certainly your indication about what lessons learned are really important. Is there anything before we close out that you guys would sort of like to offer? And I'll start with you, Mary, in terms of looking forward, looking backwards, looking forwards. Any thoughts, general thoughts?
I think the best way to learn is learning by doing. So as we move forward, we need to keep studying and keep learning about the project so that we can inform future projects. I think that's very important.
Thank you so much, George.
I would think, again, the art of compromise is still very important, that we share, and be brutally honest at times as agencies that, hey, that's really going to affect this or really affect that. And, but then don't just stop there, be able to offer maybe a solution at the same time. So again, the interaction of the agencies and make sure everybody's involved, and encourage the public to get involved as well. Again, through public meetings, public outreach, things like this forum, hopefully generates interest that people would come forward with their ideas and suggestions. Again, they may not all be taken, but at least it helps us make sure we don't miss something.
Thanks, George. Nick, I'm going to let you close us out, and before we get going with the next panel.
Yeah, I would say, it's hard to follow Mary and George with those comments. So it's really nice to be on the panel with Mary and George, and I hope carried my weight here. But on our end, for the portals, that was a 10-minute presentation. We've learned so much about how the data are being used, and I'd encourage folks to just continue to reach out to us and let us know how you're using the information, and even spend a little bit of time with us if you have questions, because there's certainly a lot we've learned about how the data could and should be versus maybe shouldn't be used.
Great, thank you so much, Nick, Mary, George, and thank you for giving us your time and knowledge and feedback. Really appreciate it. And I think we'll close this panel out and move on to our next one. And just as I do that, just as a reminder to folks, and to keep putting questions and suggestions or requests into the chat box, because those are being captured for future consideration, as well as we'll maybe have a chance to address some of those at the end of the second panel. With that, I'd like to move on to our second panel. Brian Zelenke, who is with the Surface Currents Program Manager for NOAA and the Integrated Ocean Observing System, IUS. And as part of that role, he's the program and technical lead for the U.S. High Frequency Radar Network. And I will turn that over to Brian for his presentation.
Thank you, Daryl. Appreciate the introduction. So let's jump right in. We can go to the next slide. And today I'm going to be talking to you about one of the ocean observing networks that NOAA and its Integrated Ocean Observing System, IUS, operates, which is a high frequency radar ocean surface current mapping network. See the picture over there, courtesy of one of the 11 regional associations of IUS, Maricus, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Association, that shows an example of surface current model that you can get using information like the kind that are provided with HF radar, showing speed and direction. You guys can see all of the topics we'll be covering in the agenda, and I'll try to go through them briskly in the interest of our time. Next slide, please. So, for those of you in the audience, wind developers or otherwise, whose interests may extend beyond the Mid-Atlantic, a note that high-frequency radar ocean surface current mapping is not solely a United States interest. Each one of these little green push pins that you see on this map here indicates the location of an HF radar around the world. And I will confess that when I made this map, I was using a bit of a dated information source. So there are additional sites above and beyond this, and in fact, that footprint is growing. So any of the information that I share here will be also applicable to those other countries around the world that are likewise using this technology in their ocean observing. So just to know. Next slide. So focusing here on the United States, again, we see in the lower left map of the US with push pins, where we have our approximately 160 HF radar sites. And you can see in the upper right, courtesy of some of the folks in the Mid-Atlantic region, an example of what an HF radar antenna looks like with them standing next to it. A very low profile instrument, basically reminiscent of a flagpole. They got some guide wires on this one to help it be extra wind stable. So it is a shore-based technology. It's not in the water. And from shore, HF radars are able to send out a radio wave pulse that bounces off of ocean waves, and from the Doppler shift in the return signal can tell the speed and direction of ocean surface currents out well beyond the horizon. In fact, 150 plus kilometers offshore is routine. And this is very broad coverage, basically over the better part of the US outer continental shelf. And in various resolutions, typical for our longest range would be getting a result every 6 kilometers kind of in a grid. So as if you had thousands and thousands and thousands of current meters across the US outer continental shelf. And these are real-time, near real-time data. You get a result every hour on the hour. Next slide, please. So knowing the speed and direction of the ocean surface currents, great. What does one do with that? Let's delve. Next slide. So the information from that ocean observing system, that bit of physical oceanography, is used for a number of applications, including search and rescue by the Coast Guard, tracking the fate of oil spills, and deploying response technology and cleanup options in advance, marine navigation, also applicable to marine weather, coastal monitoring for things like harmful algal bloom tracking, and protection of beach and fisheries. And we also have technologies under development, as you can see there as well. We have this wheel at the center where you see IUSE, and on the ring of the wheel are all of the organizations that are partners with us who utilize this particular technology, and others operated by NOAA and its Integrated Ocean Observing System. And then on that furthest extent of the circle, you see all of the different topic areas and focuses that these data are applicable to. So really, we touch the whole country. Thank you. If you could back up slightly for me. Perhaps this is an indication I need to move it along a little faster. Next slide, though, please. Thank you. So I will be focusing on, for this particular talk, one of the applications is the US Coast Guard. And here we have an example in the mid-Atlantic of the data usage of HF radar, which you can see from the graph on the right, growing, and we see that trend continuing in the future. And likewise, you can get a sense from the information here on the slide of just how frequent this is. And again, we don't foresee this decreasing. Rather, we expect the customers that the US Coast Guard represent using our data increasingly in the future. Next slide, please. Again, now a picture in the mid-Atlantic with a little place mark to show you search and rescue cases from one example year. These are historical data from 2014, but this would be representative of most years. So you get a sense of how frequent this is and how ubiquitous the need for information to help track people or objects in the water is. Next slide. So here we have an animation. This is an earlier one that helped really motivate the growth of that network to the national size that you see now. But in this animation, pretend you are the black drifter, which was literally a physical drifter that got thrown overboard a ship, and the Coast Guard software that they use with its environmental information as inputs was used to try to track that drifter. Their best guess without HF radar was the red line with its circle at the end. And then when we added HF radar data into the Coast Guard's model, their best guess turned into the blue dot. So if you're the black dot, the question here is, would you rather have the Coast Guard as you're floating in there in your life jacket trying to look for you around the red dot, or would you prefer the Coast Guard to try to be looking for you around the blue dot? Next slide, please. This is the final frame showing the elapsed time over that. It's pretty stark from this, and this is again an earlier example. We've gotten better at this over time. Just how much more accurate you can be using information, ocean observing. Obviously, you would rather, if you're the black dot, you would hope the Coast Guard's looking right around the blue one to try to find you, not the red one. Next slide. So how does this relate to wind turbines? Next slide, please. So here we see an example map from BOEM. Hopefully this is reasonably current for the Mid-Atlantic, and then also those states around the country where offshore wind is contemplated in the near future. Short answer is that everywhere offshore wind is being contemplated, there already exists HF radar, and because of that over-the-horizon nature, that long distance, there's really no way that there isn't a mitigation that we can have by, say, oh, relocating a wind farm to a different location or spacing the turbines differently. Offshore wind and HF radar have to learn to live together because there's 100% overlap in places where there's going to be offshore wind and where there's HF radar and other observing technologies. Next slide, please. So this is an example of one of the raw data products from one of those HF radars showing what it looks like normally. This is courtesy of our researchers at Maricruz. Next slide, please. And then here's an example of what would happen to those data if a wind farm was placed in this black square. The spinning metal blades of wind turbines confuse these HF radars, corrupting the signal and blanking out large swaths of their information. Next slide. So on the left, we have an example of coverage as it is at present from a number of different HF radars. In this case, we've color shaded each one of those stations, radio velocities, like you saw in the previous slide, green, blue, black, etc., showing you the overlapping coverage. And we've also shown wind farm locations that are proposed. On the right-hand slide, if all those wind farms were built out maximally at some point in the future, this is something of we call that a worst case scenario of what would happen to the HF radar coverage. So you can see that absent any mitigation measures, our ability to measure the surface ocean would be very significantly disrupted, and likewise search and rescue capabilities that we feed would be equally degraded. Next slide. So HF radar is an integrated product. So on the left, you see from all those overlapping radials, this is kind of like a final product you would get. On the left is an actual example of ocean surface current data. And on the right is, again, the calculation that you would end up with if you had all those wind farms from that decimated area. Basically, this would, unmitigated, this would cripple this observing technology. Next slide. So obviously, because of this challenge, we are working with a number of different partners on mitigations to help with the HF radar systems being able to deal with spinning metal blades in their field of view and back out the interference from that signal and either eliminate turbine polluted data or otherwise discriminate between the difference of the motion of the blades and the motion of the ocean, and being able to tell the currents again within the turbine fields. This is a work in progress, however, as you can see, and one that researchers from Maricruz and others in the Mid-Atlantic are working on, as you can see from some of these links. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and basically this leads us to a couple of choices when it comes to ocean observing, and can either altering our high frequency radars or somehow altering the wind farms. And we are actively working to alter our high frequency radars by tuning their software and also contemplating hardware changes. But that also means that there's some participation necessary from the wind farms. Again, I mentioned that moving the wind farms or relocating them isn't an option. So now we're looking to partner in terms of data sharing, both understanding information in the wind farms like turbine rotor speed and nacelle direction, but also getting information from within the wind farms. A rather straightforward mitigation and a rather inexpensive one is to instrument the areas within wind farms with other current meters and other oceanographic observing sensors and telemeter those data already to our existing IUCE data banks that can then forward them onto the Coast Guard to help fill those holes, because almost certainly no mitigation technology is going to be perfect. And the last point I'll mention is that for this to work and work well, it needs to be a sustained relationship and partnership with offshore wind developers, right? Because as I showed in these couple of examples here, the way wind farms look and their radar signal and the way they interrupt a radar signal may change as wind farm technology evolves to use different styles and materials compositions of wind turbines. So we want to be prepared not just for a mitigation that works now, but a mitigation that's an enduring asset for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and I appreciate that, and stay tuned for questions at the end of this session. I was interested in that one slide you showed where you can see the level of research and concern going on across the board, and as you make a point, it's not something that we can just ends with one study, but it has to be a sustained operation over time. Thank you, and then we'll turn now to Dr. Lindy Heiss-Dunton, who is the Executive Director of the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance. ROSA is a partnership formed by fishermen and offshore wind leaders in collaboration with U.S. federal and state management experts to enhance scientific understanding necessary to support the coexistence of wind energy development and sustainable fisheries. Dr. Heiss-Dunton is a fisheries scientist with a multidisciplinary background in marine science, environmental policy, and offshore development. And with that, I will turn it over to her. Thank you for being here, Lindy.
Great, thank you, Daryl. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background on ROSA if you're not familiar. ROSA was really formed because there was a recognized need for coordinated regional science, specifically focusing on offshore wind development and fisheries. And there was limited capacity within the existing groups and agencies. In a lot of cases, there's just a few people that are working on offshore wind in a given group. There was a forum needed to improve cooperative partnerships and a general need to really increase our data and knowledge of the potential effects of wind energy development on fisheries and ocean ecosystems. So ROSA was formed in early 2019 as a 501c3 nonprofit through a joint industry partnership between the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, or RODEO, and offshore wind developers. I came on board as our first executive director in February 2020, and we've been working over the last little more than a year to really get the organization up and running as quick as possible and advance our research and monitoring goals. Next slide, please. So ROSA's objectives are to really identify our regional research and monitoring needs, to provide a forum for coordinating existing programs, including the work that's being done by Mako and Marco and others, to really focus on this central idea of collaboration, partnerships, and cooperative research to advance our regional understanding, and to facilitate and improve the standardization and access to data, to administer research, and then as research is done, to disseminate that research and communicate the findings. So we function in kind of a three-part organizational structure. We have a board of directors, like a typical nonprofit, that's equally represented by offshore wind developers and commercial fishing representatives. Then we have our broad advisory council. And so this is really what drives our direction and focus. Our advisory council includes both commercial and recreational fishermen, offshore wind developers, federal agencies, including BOEM and NOAA Fisheries. And from NOAA Fisheries, it's both the Northeast Fisheries Science Center and GARFO. The states from Maine to North Carolina, the New England and Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Councils, and the ASMFC. So they all have representation on our advisory council. And then we have our broad group of research advisors, which includes representatives from all of those sectors, plus others like academics, consultants, NGOs, and others that are available as needed to advise on kind of technical scientific input. Next slide, please. So our role in offshore wind research is really to focus on the science to inform policy. So, it's research that improves our understanding of potential impacts and helps reduce uncertainty. Research that informs policy and regulatory processes to really support evidence-based decision-making and to support the research and monitoring requirements in state and federal regulatory process. Central to our mission is, collaborative and cooperative work. And so we have a broad structure that includes representations from multiple sectors, as I just mentioned. And we really try to work across those sectors to identify priority needs for applied research and to improve the way that we coordinate regionally. One of the central goals of ROSA is to aim for a really inclusive, transparent, and unbiased process. So we're trying to kind of get everyone together to discuss the needs, prioritize them, and be as open as possible in that process. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of strategies for research and monitoring related to fisheries, and I should note that our focus at ROSA is on both kind of the fish ecology, so the species, the habitats, those type of things, as well as the research that can support a better understanding of the socioeconomic impacts on the fishing industry. So there's things like guidance and tools and templates, and I'll talk a little bit about some monitoring plan guidance that we developed. Things like data management and sharing tools. Nick just talked about the portals. That's an incredible, data sharing tool and visualization tool. There's project and issue specific research and monitoring. We hear a lot right now about the, making sure we have a good understanding of the baseline data and kind of near-term needs as projects are being built. The need to improve coordination and communication across projects. And think about, different issues and concerns either in kind of a sub-region or broadly kind of coast or even nationally wide. And then we look at, a broader scale integration of research and monitoring, things like cumulative impacts, impacts to socioeconomics, implication of scientific surveys. So this is one that has becoming more frequently discussed. There's a real concern about access of survey vessels once the turbines had built, and this comes up a lot with the NOAA Fisheries Bigelow Trawl survey and the concerns about access of that survey and then the implications to fishery management. And so thinking about whether we have to proactively consider mitigating those survey designs and planning for those changes. And with that, kind of looking at the development of innovative research tools. So some of these are to address some of those access issues, things like, adding in camera surveys or eDNA or acoustic telemetry or other techniques. And some is things like just discussing ways to standardize our methods, our gears, and our research infrastructure. So I'm really looking forward to tomorrow's session on innovation, where we'll hear hopefully some more of that. Next slide, please. So at ROSA, our practice is to allow our advisors to drive our process. So our advisory council provides our overall leadership, our strategic guidance, and it drives our direction and focus. So at our November advisory council meeting, we surveyed folks to ask where our near-term focuses should be, and overwhelmingly the response was on baseline. So the table on the left there is the results of that survey that we did during the meeting. And it's a little bit wonky because we edited on the fly and ended up having kind of 3 options for baseline. But when you add them together, it's the clear majority of what we were told, the focus and near-term priority really should be. So we've been moving that forward. In January of this year, Rutgers hosted a really great Partners in Science workshop that focused on, defining what baseline means across kind of, everything from physical oceanography all the way up to kind of wildlife and, whales and things like that. So one of the focus areas was on fish ecology. And so I participated in that workshop, and it really helped kind of set the stage of defining what baseline might mean, what the temporal scales might be for that, and how we can start thinking about how to improve our baseline data. We picked this up again at our March Advisory Council meeting to refine some of these near-term priorities, and then followed up with our governance with a survey to really ask, what should we spend our time and effort on? And we'll be discussing that at our next advisory council meeting on June 17th. Other key priorities that we heard from our advisory council at that meeting were things like expanding our monitoring guidance, and this is partially complete and partially ongoing, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. To look at a longer term regional kind of research plan, so this need for a broad regional strategy for research, and we'll be working on that this summer. Looking at improving our data management, storage, and access, and that's ongoing. I'll highlight that as well. And then looking at how we can do research to support socioeconomics and our better understanding. And that one we're hoping to build off of a really great workshop that was done by a recent ICES working group that focused on socioeconomic implications. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I wanted to highlight a few recent collaborative projects that have really helped improve our process, our information sharing, and identify gaps and needs. So one with the synthesis of the science project on fisheries and offshore wind. There was a symposium last fall, and there's a white paper that should be coming out later this year that'll do a really great job to help identify kind of the state of knowledge and where some of the gaps may be. Last year, there was a new ICES working group formed on offshore wind development and fisheries, which Andy Lipsky at the Science Center is one of the chairs. This is a great opportunity to bring together experts from the US and Europe. So we had our first meeting in April of last year, and there'll be another one coming up in June. And as I mentioned, in March, there was a really great workshop on the socioeconomic implications of offshore wind on fishing communities, and really looking forward to that report. And then at ROSA, we've been working on our monitoring guidance. And so we developed guidance for offshore wind development and fisheries monitoring. We had a broad working group that included both state and federal government fisheries managers, fisheries scientists, fishing industry representatives, and offshore wind developers. That went out for public comment last fall, and it was finalized just recently in March. Next slide, please. So just a moment on the offshore wind monitoring framework and guidelines. This began in June 2020, directly to address a need identified by NOAA Fisheries. There is guidance out there from BOEM and others, but it leaves a fair amount of room for interpretation. And the agencies were seeing that there was a lot of variation in the plans that they were reviewing, and it led to a lengthy review process. So there was a need for more standardized plans that really included clear objectives and hypotheses of why the research and monitoring was being done. So the monitoring guidance that we developed builds upon the guidance from BOEM, member expertise, and others to highlight best practices and elements that would really improve future monitoring plan submission. We initially set out to develop kind of a quick turnaround template style guidance, but after the public comment period and some follow-up calls that we had with the state and federal regulatory agencies to make sure it really aligned with the existing standards, it led to the reorganization of the document and the creation of a more comprehensive framework. And so this was a really great first step to improve our regional coordination for research and monitoring and help standardize recommendations for monitoring plans to make sure that we focus on designing studies that are informative and answer the right questions. And we also, within that document, highlighted various resources available. Next slide, please. One of the other near-term priorities that we're hearing loud and clear is a need for improved data management, storage, and access. And so although there is guidance and requirements for storing and requesting data and data transparency, the methods are really not specific, and it's much more difficult and unclear to do this in practice, either if you have data and you want to store it somewhere, or you want to request data and getting the right level of detail. And so we've recently formed a fisheries research data group to focus on this and developed a request for proposals really as a first step to summarize current resources for data management, storage, and access, identify gaps and needs, and to help improve data sharing. So the intention here is to just kind of get an idea of the current state of play, to build upon several prior and ongoing efforts, and then look at how we can improve data management, storage, and access, and make recommendations through that. And if anyone is interested, that RFP is available on our website. Thank you. Next slide. So, in the work that we're doing through ROSA, we've had several kind of lessons learned and best management practices that are kind of ongoing and being developed. So we recognize a need for really a strategic regional framework and approach for research and monitoring, so that we're kind of thinking about this in the big picture and across groups that are working on this. There's a real need for the development of processes to prioritize short and long-term goals. The list of kind of gaps and needs are quite long, and so we're developing strategies to help prioritize them and narrow our focus. It's important to have well-designed studies that have clear kind of objectives and hypotheses, so that they can improve our understanding of the potential impacts and help reduce uncertainty. And that studies and data sharing tools must be designed to be integrated at scales from kind of project specific to regional. So even if you are, doing a research project or monitoring project that focuses on a specific area or specific, offshore wind project, that it can be designed and shared in a way to allow for integration into broader studies. And this was some of the focus of some of the ideas that are brought out in the monitoring guidance, as well as the data sharing work that we're picking up now. And the goal overall is to do research and monitoring that can inform evidence-based decision making. So for us, it's clear that collaboration is key to work across sectors, to identify priorities, to focus on building true collaborative partnerships among various groups, and to really aim for this inclusive, transparent, and unbiased process. Next slide, please. And with that, if you'd like any more information on us, there's our website and my email as well, and I'll turn it back over to Daryl. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindy. I really appreciate that. It's very informative. There's a lot of work, a lot of activity going on. I'm going to turn it over to, stay tuned for the question and answer at the end, but I'm going to turn it over now to Captain Stuart Griffin. He attended SUNY Maritime College and sailed as a merchant marine deck officer immediately after graduation. Began an apprenticeship with the Pilots Association for the Bay and River Delaware in 1994. He doesn't look that old, I'm sure. Has been actively piloting on the Delaware since 1997. Since 2017, Captain Griffin has served as chairman of the Mariners Advisory Committee for the Bay and River Delaware, and he's always a informative person to talk to and exchange information with. And I've learned several things from him, and I'm sure he is happy to be here and share some of his knowledge over the years with us. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Captain Griffin.
Thanks a lot, Daryl. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here today, and really find it interesting to be sort of an outlier on this panel with respect to the fact that so many very accomplished people and from a very data and science-driven background, I say an outlier in that we tend to be operational in focus, and so I hope to bring a little bit of that perspective to the conversation today. Yeah, of course, Mr. George Detweiler, who spoke earlier, sort of also brings that operational focus to things. So on to the next slide, please. I'm going to share basically just a handful of lessons learned in the years of engagement thus far with the offshore wind industry and the development of it that we've learned in the maritime industry, and sort of hopefully that will speak to some of the best practices. So the first lesson I'd like to talk about is the fact that I believe that BOEM and the Coast Guard now know the most effective points of access to work with the maritime industry. Our industry engagement started a decade and a half ago on a very a very casual level, we were cautious observers, and I'd say probably about 10 years back, we started to take more interest in the industry, the potential offshore wind industry that we knew could affect one of our areas of responsibility, namely the Outer Continental Shelf. And that's so important to us in the maritime industry because the OCS includes our sea lanes, our port approaches, traditional coastwise routes, and also offshore anchorages, which serve our ports. So for the first several years of engagement, things, as everyone knows, moved along at a very measured pace. And frankly, it wasn't entirely clear to us if the industry would ever gain traction. That has certainly proven to not be the case. And in the last 5 years, that role of as a casual observer for us has very rapidly evolved into active engagement with developers, of course, BOEM and the Coast Guard, the fishing industry, and other stakeholders in the near coastal space. As well, that pace that we've talked about, several folks have referenced today, and I think it's very important. George mentioned being mindful that the pace doesn't get too fast, but you know, we've seen exponential rate of change in the last 4 to 5 years. And you know, for us, a good analogy would be if the offshore wind industry were a ship, she'd been running on dead slow ahead for years. And now in the last 4 to 5, we watched that speed transition all the way up to full ahead. And my personal engagement with it is, as Daryl mentioned, I'm a ship driver, I'm a river pilot, but I've also been the chairman of the Harbor Safety Committee for the Port of Philadelphia for the last 4 years. And it's really an honor to be to chair this forum that brings together stakeholders, a very diverse cross-section of stakeholders, to engage with all manner of government agencies, BOEM, the Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, to name just a few, and really a great representation of the port world. We come together to consider safe navigation and planning policy, and increasingly in the last few years, endeavor to have a voice to inform permitting and construction of offshore wind projects, and to provide the perspective of mariners who are actively going to move vessels through these spaces and have been doing so for years. So I'm happy to say, you know, I think our forum, the Harbor Safety Committee structure, has really proven to be the ideal way to engage with the offshore industry and the planning and permitting processes that support that industry. And so I'm happy to say that I think one of our takeaways, one of our lessons learned collectively, is that the regulatory agencies now share that conviction about how best to engage at the Harbor Safety Committee level. You know, the reason is because we build consensus. That's what we do on a daily basis. We solve navigation safety issues collectively by coming together, by talking, by compromising, and finding common ground. And it's a wonderful functional system at the estuary level. And those federal partners that I already mentioned, the Coast Guard, Army Corps, NOAA, and BOEM, among others, they're already fully engaged with the stakeholders there at the estuary level through the Harbor Safety Committee. And now we have an opportunity to really just extrapolate that to the near coastal space and to the offshore wind industry. So we have a nice functional model that's really quite plug and play ready. The relationships that we have at the port levels up and down the coast are extremely collaborative and strong, and frankly, they're just a product of years and years of work. And many folks who preceded me have worked to build these relationships with both the agencies and the stakeholders, and so we see this natural fit occurring. Locally, we have 2 developers that are actively attend our Harbor Safety Committee meetings, and they've become integrated members of our port community. I believe that the developers as well appreciate the value of this collaborative model of deconfliction that we've already built, and they see our committee structure as the natural choice to engage with the industry. And I'm happy to say that those developers have encouraged input from the maritime industry in the permitting processes affecting their specific wind energy leases, including direct comment by the committee, which represents the port community on a broader scale, specific comment to develop the navigational safety risk assessments, comment on site assessment plans and surveying operations, and by extension, the construction and operation plans for those different lease blocks. Next slide, please. The next lesson learned I'd like to speak to is that I believe offshore wind issues are local, regional, national, and even international simultaneously. And this, to me, is important. Locally, geographically specific navigation concerns, they're almost hyperlocal in scale, hydrography, vessel types and traffic patterns that we see in a given estuary or a certain port approach, and overlapping uses in an area which grow out of the specific nature of a port. And as many people know, all ports are unique. We have lots of similarities, but they also have very unique, I like to call it ecosystems. Going one step larger to the regional level, which sort of overlaps nicely with the Coast Guard district setup, what we see is that the density of development that's happening now and going to be quickly moving into the construction phase in the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast US, due to that density, vessel patterns in the nearshore spaces are going to be affected by the impact of multiple wind energy areas, and hence a comprehensive view of these cumulative impacts has truly become critical to inform the processes going forward. And I'm happy to say that there are several Coast Guard initiatives that George Detweiler spoke to earlier, including offshore routing measures, port access route studies, and other rulemakings that are in the works and potentially overlapping and informing one another. The fact that the industry is leaping forward in such a substantive fashion and the supportive policy has to sort of rush to meet it with this growth, carefully considered guidelines and policies and processes that make these processes predictable for the participants. That includes developers and stakeholders. Really, in my opinion, will determine the health and the success of the industry, and also the extent of the impacts on other shared uses such as maritime commerce and fisheries. On the international level, by virtue of its siting on the OCS, the U.S. offshore wind development is going to likely necessitate even international regulatory changes. And to an example of that would be the fact that certain aspects of our port approaches, such as traffic separation schemes, are codified at the international level by the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. And any changes to the existing structure of offshore port approaches on the US coastlines will necessitate potentially international rulemaking efforts to make changes to those to respond to offshore wind development. So it's really incumbent upon all of us as stakeholders and regulators to view these issues through these multiple lenses. Next slide, please. The next lesson learned, the important takeaway, is that holistic planning is of the utmost importance. The left image that you see on the screen before you represents the present near coastal reality just outside the Delaware Bay. That shows our traffic separation schemes and some precautionary areas. And this paradigm that currently exists has been fairly static for decades. And as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. It's not too burdensome. It's not too overwhelming. The right image, by contrast, represents one possible future reality for the allocation of space and the movement of vessels in that same near coastal space just offshore Delaware. And the contrast couldn't be, I think, any more stark. It demonstrates the impact of offshore wind development on our port approaches, and also seeks to demonstrate the interconnectedness of the ports on the East Coast as a system, as a holistic system, and the need to view it in such a framework. The regional and, I like to say, whole coast nature of offshore wind development on the US East Coast is going to really require an approach like this to look at the interactions of these various wind energy areas and how they collectively impact maritime commerce. For example, the approaches to the Port of New York via the Sandy Hook Pilot Station, that approach is 135 miles 135 nautical miles from the approaches to the Port of Philadelphia via the Delaware Pilot Station. The impact, the interactions of these two geographically disparate port approaches are tied together. They always have been historically tied together, but even more so in the context of offshore wind development. And we're happy to know that the folks at Coast Guard headquarters and George Detweiler, of course, and his colleagues are looking carefully at potential offshore routing measures to look at the effects in a cumulative way and to look at mitigation measures. So these studies that are going on at various levels at the Coast Guard, at the district level, at the headquarters level, they all overlap, they all inform one another, and I'm grateful to say that the Coast Guard has actively sought input from the maritime industry for all of these efforts, and I think that the final products that are going to result from these considerations are going to be valuable and provide solid inputs to the BOEM planning and permitting processes. Next slide, please. The next lesson learned is, in just a couple of words, space matters. Generally, what we in the maritime industry do is we safely move large objects through relatively small spaces on a daily basis, and we try to do it safely and quietly, and efficiently, I might add. The photo you're looking at is just a standard meeting situation in the Delaware River, where the channel at this point is about 800 feet wide, and you see two ships in a meeting situation, and the combined beam or the combined width of those two ships is 315 feet. And I use this just to illustrate perspectives of scale and that we need to sort of just extrapolate this out a bit to the offshore space and imagine a similar scenario with turbine structures on both sides of the channel, which in the offshore space would be our port approaches. And you get a sense of why our industry is focused very much on preserving space. And the primary concern for our industry in the context of offshore wind development is really, it boils down to adequate sea room. And sea room means the preservation of appropriate open space for vessels to maneuver safely, for emergency ship handling scenarios, and particularly in the context of severe weather. So an opportunity exists to prevent conflict-related delays around siting, and the solution is to thoroughly socialize the plans with the maritime industry and the Coast Guard before we get into site assessment plans and costly survey resources are mobilized by the developers. Next slide, please. Our relatively young industry is rapidly moving forward, and I believe we're moving towards a more sustainable model. Local navigation experts such as pilot groups and harbor safety committees, I believe, hold the key to effective site planning, and if we're consulted early enough, can help avoid costly delays and inefficiencies, and also avoid unsafe scenarios. So the solution there is, the takeaway is to engage early and to engage often. And we have a goal of having local and regional maritime industry reps sit down with BOEM and the Coast Guard at the earliest planning meetings when considering the creation of new lease blocks going forward, and continuing to remain actively engaged throughout. Next slide, please. So this is just a slide to talk very briefly about what we need, and it's really to illustrate the importance of data. You see on the left a standard NOAA navigational chart, and on the right a frame grab from the Marco data portal showing the AIS heat maps. And as mariners, our frame of reference tends to be experiential and anecdotal. Of course, we use data to determine our parameters for basic operations, but historically, shared wisdom, shared institutional wisdom is the foundation for a lot of our operations. So knowing that works well for us as vessel operators, but when it comes to informing policy, we need data. And hence the data portal is of critical nature. And we can get more into the specifics of those needs and how the data from the portal is critical to us and to informing policy. But I would just say that the industry is grateful to be an active participant in the dialogue, and we look forward to continuing to participate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. I really appreciate that insight. And I'd like to invite the other panelists to come back on screen, and let's talk a little bit. And again, encourage folks who are attending to put some questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those in a moment. But I'd like to start with just with the last panel in order. Brian, Lindy, and Stuart to maybe respond to the two questions here. And you have different stakeholders for sure, with different needs, different time schedules, and so on. Can you tell, from your perspectives, what are some successful strategies that you have used or that you think might be implemented to get information to your stakeholder groups? I'll start with you, Brian.
Yes. One of the most successful strategies we've had is working and coordinating on the regional level through our regional associations like Maracuz in the Mid-Atlantic, also nearby Syracuse and Socorro on the East Coast, and others. By utilizing that knowledge that comes from people in the area, universities, other industry partners, we're able to extend beyond our federal perspective to really get at a larger swath of the community. So I would hope in these interactions, like Mako is doing, we can continue to leverage those regional relationships as we grow this out to be a national resource.
Thanks. Lindy?
Yeah, that's a great question, Daryl. And I think for me at ROSA, there's a type of information that we're trying to get out just kind of broadly to stakeholders in the sense of kind of public information sharing. And then there's a type of kind of communication and coordination that we do with our partners, so our kind of agency partners, our industry partners, our science partners. And I think it varies. So for us, we do a lot about thinking about communication strategies and things that go out to our mailing list versus things we do in our advisory council. And our strategy more than anything is to be as transparent and open as possible. So things like our advisory council meetings are open to the public and people can attend them. We try to do things that can go out to our mailing list that anyone can subscribe to. And then we look for the places where we really want to hear specifically from our advisors. And so we'll do things like send surveys or specifically ask for the input of saying, where should we focus? What's important? What are your big concerns? And make sure they, have that chance to advise us as much as possible as well.
Thank you, and thanks, Lindy. Stuart, you mentioned the Harbor Safety Committee, and in terms of your stakeholders who are on the ocean users, what strategies do you have to get information out, do you think, successful?
Well, Daryl, we're really fortunate that the construct of the Harbor Safety Committee is so functional and solid already, and frankly, collaboration and dissemination of information and looking at issues are really sort of what we already do, and the Harbor Safety Committee seeks to inform its constituents on a daily basis about navigation related activities on the waterway and in and around the estuary. So really we're just taking advantage of this forum to not only spread information, but also that we can bring developers in and integrate them into the port community so that the constituents, the stakeholders locally recognize the importance of this issue and then develop the relationships firsthand, and then the flow becomes very natural.
Thank you all three. Again, the second question here is in terms of sort of maybe turning it around, what are some successful strategies for your stakeholders to take their diverse views and bring that down to something like concise recommendations, not just sort of all over the board, but really some solid recommendations that can be moved forward by other agencies as well as developers. We'll start with you, Brian.
Sure. For me, it comes back to one of those slides, actually the last slide I spoke on, where I said for me, what do you want HF radar to do? How do you want to change those? How do you want to change wind turbines? I think for stakeholders, making sure that you have a clear sense of what it is you want specifically wind turbine operators to do or to do differently, clearly communicating those needs. And then the same thing, what are you wanting to do specifically that the wind turbine operators should know about. And then coming together to express those in groups like this and others where you have a dialogue with the developers to find out where, which of those actions are potentially quite onerous, which of those actions might be easier than you think, and making it a discussion rather than necessarily just holding up and communicating a point of view, making it a partnership.
Thank you. And Lindy?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we focus on is, this need to take the concerns and the ideas and then to kind of have an iterative process to narrow that down to actionable items. And so when you ask folks what are their concerns, that is a broad swath of information that you can get. And so, it's to kind of start with those societal concerns, like think about, okay, among those, what are our priorities, both kind of in the near term and then kind of looking out for several years, and then taking what those priorities might be and then turning them into specific questions. So with the example of baseline, we hear we need more baseline. We don't know enough about the baseline. But then when you try to define what baseline means, that's much more complicated. And so the Rutgers workshop that I mentioned did a great job of kind of starting to refine that of, okay, for instance, in fisheries and kind of fish ecology, is it certain species? Is it certain habitats? Is it certain issues? What's the temporal scale that we should be thinking about in establishing a baseline, and kind of the minimal kind of number of years of data we might need, and then how to actually gather more data to fill those gaps and what that might mean. So it's this kind of iterative process of kind of starting with these big ideas and narrowing them down and then turning that into funding priorities, things like that we can take action on. And it's certainly difficult, and we don't have all the answers, but we're working on it.
Thank you. And Stuart, how would you follow on that in terms of bringing things down into concise recommendations?
Daryl, for us, because we have a pretty diverse set of constituencies represented through our committee structure, unfortunately, those different constituencies have been hearing about offshore wind and siting issues for years on a quarterly basis. So that, as new issues come to the fore around offshore wind, when we bring them up at the committee level, we then just seek input from the various user groups, and often what we do is we'll form a subcommittee, or in the case of like the most recent Coast Guard port access route study, we had an industry roundtable where we invite folks from the Harbor Safety Committee to come participate and weigh in on specific concerns for their user group related to things like routing measures in the near coastal space. So really, we just convene and converse and then distill that down to the most important and most critical issues that everyone faces, and again, try to build consent, move forward with recommendations.
Thank you. And I see a question in the chat box, and it kind of goes to Brian about high frequency radar. And one of the slides you showed very beginning showed the high frequency radars around the world. And I guess one of the questions that came up is, in terms of talking about mitigation, have other studies been done where other wind farms are in existence to deal with mitigation issues with regard to interference? And are you working on bringing those into the Atlantic sphere?
Excellent question. There has been research done primarily in England in regards to the interference that turbines impart on HF radar, but they hadn't focused on mitigation. They focused instead on describing that interference. And the mitigation that they came up with was relocating the HF radars, which worked for them. Our network is much more extensive. So unfortunately, there isn't a ready-made foreign solution that we can apply here domestically. However, we are in coordination with those original researchers in England and would like to do so with others in other areas. But we really are, as far as I understand, I would love to be corrected if I'm wrong, on the vanguard here of investigating and funding mitigation solutions.
Yeah, it does seem that the US network is quite maybe one of the more extensive ones than other places around the world, for sure. Maybe I could invite our other panelists from our previous session to turn their cameras on and just join us for the before we close out here. But let me throw a question at you, Stuart. In terms of the Harbor Safety Committee, you're working with the Mariners Advisory Committee for the Delaware River and Bay. And how does communication work between, you talked about local versus regional, between different harbor safety committees along the coast?
Daryl, our industry networking is pretty good. You know, we are one of the ways that we sort of track the issues that are going on at other. We have, of course, national conferences where the harbor safety committees come together and share best practices and lessons learned on a biannual basis, and those are of great value. And offshore wind, of course, has been on the agenda at those most recently, and it's rising to the top of lists of considerations. Also, the fact that we're very engaged with not only our local Coast Guard sectors, but also the Coast Guard district at the district level, where sort of these routing issues and offshore rulemakings are often being considered. By virtue of that sort of broader regional engagement, we kind of track the issues at neighboring ports and our sort of collective functionality of the system at the regional level through that network as well.
Great, thank you. That's good to hear. I guess I might turn one of the earlier questions back to Brian, Lindy, and Stuart as well. And in terms of the data portals, is there information, where do you see gaps there, and do you see information that you'd like to see on there that isn't there, things to be added, or things that you really appreciate? Brian?
Yeah, well, I will speak to the things I would like to see added, just because I referenced it in my presentation, and I certainly appreciate the data sources that are there. The more information we can get, the better for our environmental intelligence, I say. But I would say information from within the wind farms. I know that developers do collect and instrument their own wind farms, and there's some of those data that they share publicly, others that they consider proprietary. And I would heartily encourage them to make use of those data portals, because I think you get a tremendous value add as a wind developer if you do that, especially going into like that, I'll belabor that Coast Guard scenario. I mean, the time you want to be trying to help the Coast Guard in an active search and rescue case if one of your personnel or equipment is in the water, isn't trying to figure out those pathways and that data sharing as the incident is occurring. You want that process set up well in advance. So I think it behooves the developers all the way through our federal folk and the general public to be sharing that information that isn't overly business sensitive, so that we can all leverage the knowledge that it can give us.
And Lindy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mentioned we're starting this project looking at kind of the state of play and data management and data storage. And I think, you know, one of those is to look at the type of data that's collected for fisheries research and monitoring, and where that might be housed. And I think one of the outcomes of that report will be to say, you know, here's what we have and here's what we need. And there may be some things that come out of ways to expand the data portal to include some of that information. I think, you know, to what Brian said, having, you know, information about what's in, you know, the offshore wind sites themselves and things like that to better inform our siting, our decision making, I think like that is really important. I think the portals are an outstanding resource. I know I personally use them all the time. You know, there's certain gaps, and Nick had mentioned this in some of the fisheries data. You know, not every fishery requires VMS and things like that. And I know there's already ongoing work to expand some of that. So I think there's great work going on, and we'll certainly work with Nick and Carl and others moving forward if we have recommendations for ROSA through ROSA as well.
Great, thank you. And Stuart, I'm going to give you a chance to respond there before we close out for the day.
Okay, thanks, Daryl. I would just say that I am happy to see that the portal's been including sort of more forward-looking things like proposed rulemakings and anchorage considerations, offshore anchorage areas that may be codified in the future. And to Brian's point about sensor packages in the offshore farms, I really look forward to data sharing agreements. We locally are already having conversations with one of our developers, and I think the next will soon to follow, to talk about sensor package data sharing agreements and things like that, so that we can basically just fortify the data that's flowing to folks like Marco, where science and data folks that are on this call who are much smarter than I can help direct that data to drive operational considerations for folks like me.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank you all, Nick, Mary, George, Lindy, Brian, Stuart, for participating today in this offshore wind sighting session at Mako. I'm going to encourage the other participants or attendees to continue to share their comments so that we can capture them for further consideration, and encourage everyone to sign on to the lunch sessions today at noon, and also to continue to attend the other forums tomorrow and on Thursday. Really appreciate all of you, and I'm sure that I will be working with you moving forward in the future, but I know that the discussion is ongoing, and we'll have to keep that information exchange going. Thank you again for participating, and really appreciate your time. And I'm going to close the session out now.